Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm a little bit rusty. I apologize. I haven't been on the show for a little while. I hope that everything was all right in my absence. And joining us today is Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Nick. Slightly wintry conditions here in Cape Town. We're getting that part of the year, but all fine otherwise. Thank you.
No, very much the same in Joburg. And of course, we're also joined today by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
I'm all right. It's also getting a bit chilly here. Although I think we've got a couple of weeks left, but winter definitely on the way.
Indeed. All right. So I just want to say at the start of the show, one thing I think that we don't talk about enough on the show is our great, the Daily Friends website, which is a great opinion portal. You can get all sorts of hot takes on the way that on the issues facing the country today. So go check out the dailyfriend.co.za if you don't regularly do that already. It's always got something worth reading. And to illustrate that point, we're actually going to start off with talking about a piece written by one of our regular Daily Friend writers, Jonathan Katzenellenbergen, who wrote an article about the Zimbabwean Exemption permit, which is currently before the courts. So the Zimbabwean Exemption permit was created basically when Zimbabwe's economy fell apart and huge numbers of Zimbabweans were flooding into the country illegally. This was a sort of more streamlined process to make it easier for Zimbabweans to be legalized as working immigrants in the country. And it's become very important for a huge number of Zimbabweans. About 180,000 at least are holders of Zimbabwean exemption permits, and they feed something like 1 million people, possibly, who depend on them for the work that they get as ZEP holders. But facing an increasingly anti-immigrant political climate and public mood, government seems hell-bent on removing the Zimbabwean exemption permit. And they've been taken to court over this by a number of organizations, most notably, I think, the Helen Suzman Foundation. And that court case is currently ongoing. They're hoping to, I think, finish before the ZEP permits expire in June. They were originally, I believe, supposed to expire at the beginning of this year, but they've been extended a little bit. And there's a court battle now continuing as to whether basically government followed the right procedure in revoking these ZEP permits. And it's a really difficult policy debate, I think, to have, because I can really see in this case both sides. We've recently seen, I think there was this famous incident where the MEC for Health in Limpopo was caught on camera basically telling off a Zimbabwean woman saying, why aren't you seeking healthcare in Zimbabwe? We're way overloaded here. We can't deal with you. Go back, something like that. And she was both praised and attacked for this. Some people saying she's been cruel and xenophobic, and other people saying that she was highlighting the fact that South Africa's social services, which aren't in the greatest shape already, really can't afford to also, help the people of Zimbabwe and Mozambique. But at the same time, while our social services are under stress, while jobs are scarce, while economic conditions are pretty rough out there for a lot of South Africans, Zimbabweans in particular undoubtedly contribute a lot to our economy. Until quite recently, had a quite pretty good education system. So a lot of them are relatively skilled. They, at least many of the immigrants who are here are famous for having like a good work ethic and contributing to the economy. And of course, South Africa has had a major role to play in legitimizing the ZANU-PF regime, which has destroyed the economy of that country. So one does have to wonder to what extent South Africa's foreign policy is to blame for the issues of Zimbabweans having to come here and seek work here because their country is essentially destroyed. And it really now is kind of, we're in this difficult position here where if the ZEP is revoked, is it really going to reduce the number of immigrants in the country? Probably not. In fact, most of them will probably just stay here illegally, at which point they will be open to various kinds of abuse and exploitation in various ways. So, Michael, let me start with you. What's your take on this issue? It's a difficult one, I think, for government to solve because the roots are so deep and so entangled with so many of the other policy missteps we've had over the past couple of years.
Yes, indeed. And I think Jonathan does a very good job of wrapping it all up and considering all the various factors. He notes towards the end that the net effect of educated Zimbabweans coming to South Africa is probably positive, and I certainly agree with him there. I also think, as we argue as liberals, that an open society is always better and more vibrant and more dynamic than a closed one. But of course, with that comes problems, difficulties, challenges. You have to work harder to be more efficient, to be fairer, and so on. I think on that point, that scurrilous really video of that MEC berating that poor unfortunate patient in that hospital, it unfortunately sells so well politically. There are so many people who are receptive to that, desperate people, desperate South Africans who deserve better services, and they therefore be very receptive to that kind of political message. And would not necessarily immediately see that the deficiencies are not the result of too many people or kind of excess patients, but because of the excess dysfunction, which is not going to be resolved by removing immigrants by any measure. But it is, as you say, a complex issue. Jonathan writes, for instance, that having refused to pressure Zimbabwe to improve conditions so that people might actually want to live there, we are now stuck with the consequences. And I think the other point you made is that even if this thing goes through, it's very unlikely that South Africa has the administrative or technical capacity to make sure that people who are no longer here in the legitimate sense that the government intends will actually be going anywhere. They'll simply remain and be more vulnerable. It'll just actually make things more difficult for everybody. And as he concludes, and I think this is the key thing, we could at least have in place an immigration regime that is well managed and treats people with a degree of dignity and does not leave them in the lurch. And here we have this really quite summary process that one hopes organizations who are fighting it are going to be able to stop or at least delay until there's reconsideration of it. But if not, it's not a very happy situation at all.
So Terence, there's this American political commentator who I think said what I thought was very insightful comment on America's immigration problem, which is when someone asked him, what's your opinion on it? He would say, what's your opinion on immigration policy? He would say, well, for a start, let's have one. And I think that's definitely even more so the case in South Africa, where, government sort of creates these things like the ZEP, and it has rules about how you get into the country. But in reality, a lot of these rules are far more fictitious, and they just kind of create paperwork for people who are willing to follow the rules. Whereas in reality, the borders are in many cases effectively open. And this, I think, contributes to the problem, because when people feel like they don't have kind of political or democratic control over something like the country's borders, it adds to this feeling that everything is out of control and people need to take matters into their own hands. And we've seen that with, most famously, Operation Dudula, which in many cases has taken upon themselves to eject not just illegal immigrants from various communities, but actually just foreigners of any sort, whether they're here legally or not. What's your thought on all this, Dennis?
Well, I think that we should put this into a somewhat longer context. Remember that before the 2021 riots, the biggest outbreak that I can recall was I think it was 2008, May 2008. There were effective pogroms, very bad in Gauteng, occurred elsewhere. But yeah, I think this is an example of not really having a policy, and to the extent that we had one, it prioritized political issues, the political interests of the ruling party above everything else. One thing that they made very clear over the whole Zimbabwean crisis was that ZANU-PF was not going to lose power. Everything that the South African government did was premised on that. And I think one of the great tragedies, it's often forgotten that that the early 2000 period, there was an interesting conjunction politically in the world. Thabo Mbeki was seen as representative of this new generation of African leaders. Tony Blair in Britain was very sympathetic to Africa's circumstances, and for various other reasons, so was George W. Bush. There was sympathy on the table that could have been turned into actual resources and partnerships, and that was the whole new partnership for Africa's development, which gained a lot of fanfare. But part of the deal was that support would be contingent on upping the governance game. And I think if there was one thing that put a bullet through that, it was Zimbabwe, because that was not only a governance crisis that occurred in one of those superficially stable African societies. It shouldn't happen here. Zimbabwe at least had elections. They might not have been the fairest. There were lots of underlying problems in the country, but Zimbabwe was seen as a post-colonial success story. And so, as this was watched from the outside, it descended into a sort of obscene kleptocracy, a government that was acting. Archbishop Tutu remarked at the time, Mugabe is acting like he wants someone to make a cartoon of him. Which I thought was, quite a good way of saying it. The country the African state that was actually in a position to do something, maybe imperfectly, maybe it wouldn't have turned the ship around, but that I think needed to make at least a symbolic state a stand on it, was the country supposedly championing NEPAD, and the statesman supposedly doing so, which was Mbeki. And I think that was basically the choice came: you can have NEPAD or you can have Zimbabwe, and you can have ZANU-PF, and the choice was ZANU-PF. So and now we sit with the consequences of that.
Michael, any final thoughts before we move on?
Terence,
sorry, you were muted, sir.
Am I fine now?
Yeah, you're good now.
Yeah, good. And I was just saying, I absolutely agree with Terence. I think one does need to look at the origins of these things, and this is certainly where that resides. The flood of people who are desperate to flee from a country that isn't working, South Africa's role now is to have an immigration, as you began by saying, to have an immigration policy that is actually workable, that is fair, that is dignified, and so on. I remember as a journalist, in probably the 90s, late 90s, mid 90s, reporting on various initiatives by, I think IDASA was one that had a big immigration project, trying to advise the government, trying to alert them to the fact that we had become a democracy. We were now open to the world. These are all good things, but now we need to actually shoulder the responsibility of managing that openness, and it just actually hasn't happened. It's very much a consequence of the things that Terence has outlined, and it's ironic, in fact, in that sense. Yeah.
No, definitely. All right, so let's move on to something perhaps a little bit more hopeful, and this is comments made by the Reserve Bank Governor Lesego Kanyako. He's speaking, I believe, in Washington, the United States, and he says that there needs to be sweeping reforms in our power and transport sectors in particular, and he says that these sectors in particular need to be deregulated in order to boost economic growth and lessen exchange rate volatility and sovereign risk. He also said, and this is the one that's probably going to get him the most pushback, is that the inflation target would need to be lowered to 3%, the bottom of the current range, which will be, quote, a major benefit to the fiscal policy and economic growth of South Africa, and it will reduce the potential for upward drift in the real exchange rate and cut loan service costs for the country's over-indebted public sector. Terence, what do you make of the comments by Lasejo Kanyaho? It seems once again the Reserve Bank is kind of swimming against the tide of the rest of government policy. Should we take what he says very seriously? Is it going to happen?
Is it going to happen? I think probably not. But you're quite correct about the Reserve Bank, and I think that's one small mercy that we have had a competently and professionally run Reserve Bank, and one whose independence has been maintained and for the most part respected. Brian Pottinger wrote in his book The Mbeki Legacy, that I refer to from time to time, that that's the one thing that you have to protect, because the difference between a grab what you can collective and a functioning modern state is an independent Reserve Bank. We can look across the Limpopo to Zimbabwe and see what happens when that becomes an accomplice. Now, the Reserve Bank's fundamental role is monetary policy. That's kind of what it controls: the money supply, interest rates, that sort of thing. Its remit is fairly narrow, and the tools it has, I'd say, even more so. So when he speaks on something like the need for deregulation, he is in a sense speaking outside of his own field of influence, and one might also argue his own field of expertise. Wouldn't actually be the first time that the Reserve Bank governor has expressed views like that. When Tito Mboweni was Reserve Bank governor, there was a certain irony to this, that he said that labor regulations were clawing on the government, and he was the guy who, as Minister of Labor, had introduced a lot of the stuff. So there was a certain twist around to that. He also once memorably said that he's sick of affirmative action. He's happy with his Afrikaners. They do their work and they become experts, and they don't leave for higher salaries. That was actually carried in the Financial Mail, I think, on the front page. Whatever that may have been worth, it didn't change government policy. However, I think there perhaps is a certain moral suasion that comes from having an unexciting technocrat who is at least trusted, one of the few, being willing to say this sort of thing. I suppose it's a question of trying to build up a ton with one feather at a time.
No, I think that's that's an interesting way of putting it. An interesting story that's sort of tangentially related to this, which is exactly kind of illustrating, I think, what the Reserve Bank governor is calling for, is there was this very terrible crash on the N3 highway that a lot of people, it was in the news, people were killed. And this caused a spokesperson from Action SA to call for the immediate removal of all very heavy-duty trucks from our highways. Especially anyone who's driven on the N3 will know that road is absolutely choked with trucks moving goods to and fro from Durban to Gauteng and vice versa. But there's, of course, a very good reason why trucks are filling that highway. And that's because the rail system has, in many cases, effectively collapsed. And while government is at least toying with the idea of allowing out some of our rail system to the private sector, I think between Durban and Gauteng is one of the current plans. It's going to need to think carefully about its policy in that direction to ensure that it's actually a good deal and not just some sort of half-assed attempt that will just end up destroying the idea of a public-private partnership. Michael, what do you make of what the Reserve Bank governor says, and what do you make of the Action SA call?
Indeed. Now, I do, in fact, see a kind of connection. I think Terence is quite right. There's a kind of frustration about the hope for time frame of reform, and one's constantly looking for signs of that would give us reason for optimism, signs of change, and so on. And there's also a great deal of euphemism that gets worked into these sorts of things. I suppose typically for somebody in his position, he wouldn't necessarily say things in the same way that a politician might. And you read a line like this one from his speech in Washington, where he refers to the rise in debt created by our efforts to confront weakening growth and failures of state enterprise. Now, that's, I suppose, failures of state enterprise quite strong. But he then goes on to say there's little chance of improving credit quality without new rules and more strategic use of macroeconomic policy. I mean, that's all, we don't really know what that means. We have a kind of idea. But where he talks specifically, I think, about deregulation, that is quite interesting. And as you say, there is this link with the Action SA call for the removal of heavy-duty trucks from South African roads. The fact is, we've all seen this over the past perhaps 2 decades, traveling up and down the country. Whenever you're on a national road, there are more and more big trucks, and the reason for that is quite simply because that is the most effective and efficient way for companies, for the private sector, to move their goods around. And it used not to be like that because we had an efficient railway system, or a more efficient one. And I think there was every hope, actually, after 94 that, the railways, as a big country this size, with the kind of infrastructure we had already in place, we had a huge potential to increase the capacity of the railways to serve the economy more effectively and efficiently. And the reverse, regrettably, in fact, has happened. So you now have you have huge amounts of trucks on the roads. I mean, in this accident, 41 vehicles altogether, 5 trucks, and these are these huge, big, articulated trucks carrying containers, and some also with liquid fuel, liquid cargo. I can't see whether it's milk or fuel or what is contained in the tanker. But the risk of this is borne out by this terrible accident. But then coming back to the Reserve Bank governor, saying that one of the things we need to look at is deregulation of transport. That would be a key element, I would have thought, of having any hope of improving rail, is to deregulate and allow partnerships or concessions to the private sector. And the one other thing that I was just going to say, it kind of relates in a way to our work, and the fact that we're sometimes accused of sounding like a stuck record because we keep making the same basic propositions, that essentially things are falling apart because there's an undue emphasis on the role of a feckless state that can't actually function properly, and that what needs to happen is that the much greater ability and agency of the rest of society, private sector and individuals and so on, needs to be freed up for the country to flourish. And I think even we perhaps at times get a bit bored from seeming to be saying the same things over and over again. And yet, I think it is important to realize that we do have a role in providing a sort of intellectual ecosystem in which these ideas become more and more acceptable seeming. People begin to talk about them. And there is the possibility also that we are giving reformers and potential reformers the kind of visible support that they doubtless need. And that, I tend to see speeches like this one very much in those terms. I remember it also in the 1980s, actually. And I think that was one of the significant things, those treks, those I can't think of the word, the pilgrimages almost to Lusaka in the 80s by business people and Afrikaners to Dakar and so on. It began to create the environment in which people began to think that the unthinkable was in fact thinkable. And I think that's very much where we are today.
That's exactly how the Overton window moves, and that's exactly how new ideas get into the bloodstream. Just one last thing I want to say, we talk on the show at length about the many, many policy missteps and governance failures in South Africa, but the Reserve Bank remains a sort of rare bright spot in the way our state functions. Yeah. And I would just compare, for example, a country like Turkey, which has managed to have pretty good economic growth that, I think South Africa would kill for. over the last couple of decades. But go and look at their inflation rate. And I think their President Erdogan, I think he placed his stepson or something like that in charge of the Reserve Bank there, at which point inflation went to 80%, above 80%. And it's been bouncing around. It's come down now, I think, to the 50s. But you compare that to South Africa's, while the world is experiencing a tidal wave of inflation, bounced from kind of 6% to like 8%. We're still doing okay, at least compared to some of our peers. And that's something to be thankful for. All right. Let's move on to our last story for today. And this is one of the other devastating consequences of load shedding. And I think my power is actually about to go off, so it'll be quite poignant. But anyway, spaza shops around South Africa actually contribute about 6% to South Africa's gross domestic product, which is quite a lot. You think about our ailing mining industry, and that's actually, I think, about 7 or 8% of GDP, something like that. I stand open to correction. But so it's a big deal, spaza shops. And a recent study done by Nedbank has found that load shedding seems to be really costing them in particular. And in one of the ways that it hurts South African society the most, which is that a lot of spaza shops have had to lay off people. According to the survey that Nedbank did, 2/3 of businesses operating in townships across South Africa have had to reduce employee headcounts in order to cope with the costs imposed by load shedding, lost business hours, inability to operate. Many of the small businesses around South Africa are things like salons, which do a huge booming trade. Gigi Alcock has written, I think, quite a bit about that. And yet, if you're a small salon, you can't operate when there's no electricity and you can't afford a generator. Or if you do, it seriously cuts into your profit margins. So Terence, your thoughts on this story? What lessons should we take away from it? And what can be done in the short term to maybe mitigate some of this problem? Because we know that Eskom's not going to be fixed anytime soon.
I don't know if there's a great deal we can do. No, it's tragic. Those small businesses are a necessary part of any economy. It's small scale, accessible capitalism, if you like. Now, I think we've got to be very, very careful about romanticizing it. These are businesses that need to break even. They need to make a profit. If you increase the cost structure, they're not able to do that. That's the brutal reality, and there goes power. As we're talking about it, and these are firms that or businesses, whatever you want to call them, that represent a sort of a modest step into the up the value chain, often operating in very poor communities. You are strangling you are strangling small scale entrepreneurs before they're able to get going or reach a sort of growth orientation phase. What can be done? This is actually where you need some sort of competent state. I think in very broad brushstrokes, you have to look at what other institutions might be able to step in. Community-owned power generation, the sort of AfriForum model. But no, we have a state that styles itself developmental, but I think that is simply delusional.
Michael, your final thoughts before we close up for today?
Terence is absolutely right. And could there possibly be anything as developmental as small scale entrepreneurs right across the country, accounting for 6% of the GDP, doing exactly what they are doing at the moment? And what a tragedy that they're having to face this difficulty.
Yep.
Right. And I think, it's I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, sorry. I'm a bit distracted by the power going off. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed the show and found it interesting. And we will be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show for more analysis of what's going on in our fair country. Anyway, cheers, everyone. Have a good one.